Okay, fantastic. All right. So, hey everybody, this is Lana, and we are live right now on YouTube on Let's Only Be Positive. Today, I have actually a special guest speaker, Kevin Brady, and today we're actually going to talk on the subject of anger and depression and the triggering of it. So, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you guys over to Kevin, and just Kevin, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what we're talking about today.
Okay, my name is Kevin Brady. I've been a facilitator for metapsychology and traumatic incident reduction for about 11 years. I've done work in the field for, oh boy, 26 years or so. And my experience with anger and depression is rather extensive, both personally and professionally. And I'd like to introduce the subject by saying that depression has lots of symptoms, but one of them can be sadness, and that's what many people mean when they're talking about depression, is that they talk about they feel sad. But there's a lot more that goes into depression than sadness, and it comes down to the length that you felt that way, and there not being an external environmental reason why you're depressed. If you have no food and someone's beating you all the time, depression is a natural response. So would anger be, but you wouldn't be very happy with your life if that was the case. But if everything is fine or seems fine and you can't get out of bed to face the day, then you probably have depression or something like it. But that's a medical diagnosis and something I would leave to psychiatrists. For myself, when a person comes to me and tells me that they're feeling depressed, I want them to tell me what that means to them, because it means different things to different people. Even if you look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatry, if you look at their definition of depression, it comes down to clusters of symptoms that persist for a long period of time, and there are different levels of it. There's acute depression, where a person is in danger of hurting themselves, and then there's more general depression, where it's not acute. There's no danger that they're going to hurt themselves, but they're not paying attention to their, say, taking care of like their beard. But I'm not depressed, don't worry. If they're not taking care of the way they look, if they're not keeping their house up, some part of it may be they're a rebel and they don't want to do that stuff. But very likely they like to live in a nice environment too. They just don't have the energy to face doing it every day. They can't find a reason to do it every day, that sort of thing. And so it creeps up and then overwhelms them, So depression is, we want to keep that separate from a discussion of sadness or anger, except that sadness and anger can be symptoms of depression, right? So very, very often when people take antidepressants, the first thing people notice about them is that they become angry, right? They're no longer sad and unwilling to work. They become powerhouses, but they're very angry. Now, not always, but some people, as they get better, as they cease being unwilling to take care of themselves, become very angry people. And also, when people stop taking their antidepressants, if they were feeling great, they sometimes express great amounts of anger or even physical violence. This is a fairly common side effect of coming off antidepressants. You have to really taper the dose down and get used to it, or you become violently angry, and there's a reason for that. The source of all this is the amygdala structure in the brain. So when you change the way that structure is functioning, you become angry or sad or anxious during periods where you normally would not. So that's my introduction. The part of triggering that comes into play is if depression is triggered by something that's going on in the environment, then you have a psychogenic form of depression, right? Your mind is creating that condition in your body. It may not be deliberate. In fact, almost never is depression deliberately self-induced. But your mind still is creating the effect, and you're just not necessarily aware of why it's doing it or how it's doing it. But if you notice that I'm always happy, I never feel depressed when I'm in some other environment than my home, there could be a large number of reasons for that. The home may represent change hasn't happened and I'm still in the same house, or that sort of thing. So, but it could also be that just the triggers of the house aren't present. And so I don't feel depressed when I'm outside the house. Could be sunshine. But my point is that what people consider depression needs to be examined very closely, because it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And it's been medicalized to the point where using the term depression is commonly, it means I have a psychiatric illness, meaning depression, right? So I'm very careful when people talk to me about having depression to find out if they have it diagnosed. And if they don't, or even if they do, I need to know if they're on medication and what their symptoms are, because the symptoms could be very different between different people. Is that a good introduction?
Okay. Yeah, it's great. One of the things like I want to mention is you hear cases and stories of even young kids at very, very young age. I mean, I've known kids actually literally at 6 years of age, 7 years of age. I mean, 6 years old, you really should be like a happy, hyper, excited about life. Life is great. No worries or concerns about nothing. And you experience, kids that are like depressed. Now, you may ask, like, well, you're 6 years old. Why would you be depressed right now? That's like the least of your concern should be. You have everything going for you. You're just a kid. You're learning. You're experiencing life. You're making friends in school. But yeah, this 6-year-old, this 7-year-old, these young kids are, experiencing, depression. And would you absolutely say it is the environment of the household? And same thing goes with anger, really. Also, you find very angry kids. I mean, personally, myself, and this is a trigger warning real quick for anyone that's watching. When I was little, as a child, I actually grew up in Russia in an orphanage. And so as a child, I remember, really just being angry and, and also experiencing a lot of depression as a little child. Now, could it be basically because of the environment that I was growing up in? Absolutely. But Kevin, I actually want to hear your insight on that. Why, do we see kids that are so young that are experiencing, both of depression and both of anger at such young ages?
Again, it depends on what they're calling depression. But if the person feels very overwhelmed and sad,
right,
that would be sort of a standard understanding of feeling depressed, right? Then I would assume that there was an overwhelming or sad environment. They were either wanting something that wasn't there, or
right,
wanting something that was there. So, and not feeling empowered to get what they want or to leave where they are, right? So there are other reasons. There's genetic factors. Some people are just naturally bubbly and happy people, and some others aren't. No matter how many antidepressants you gave them, they would not become bubbly and happy people. So there is a genetic factor. There's a family conditioning factor. Like you pick up the ways of expression of people around you, but also, yeah, there's environmental stimuli in there. So say someone is doing something that you can't get away from, that's painful to you, whether it's emotionally or physically, then you're not going to be able to concentrate on other things very well. You're going to be looking for a way out of the problem that you have until you find that. And until
right.
everything else doesn't matter, and if that thing is so overwhelming that you're not going to be able to get away from it, I would expect either extreme anger or complete apathy. Or flip-flopping back and forth between them, like most of the time being unwilling to pay attention, and when someone makes you, getting very angry, So that doesn't mean a parent is abusive, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. It's from the perspective of the child. The child may want something that they can't have, and that they haven't been able to communicate it, or they may not want something that they do have and not have found a way to communicate that, or even to identify that that's the problem. So we've talked about communication in the past and how important it is. With children, they do not have the communication skills that an adult has. Typically,
Right.
it's very unusual to find a kid who's really articulate and clear till they're maybe 8 or 9 years old. Earlier than that, they might be, but they're usually playing with language, learning the rules of language, not really understanding their own emotions. If you ask them if they're happy or sad, they become happy or sad because you asked about it.
Right.
So their emotional inventory, they don't know how to take stock of themselves very well yet. So the chances that they're going to be able to tell you what's going on are reduced. You're going to either need to look at their environment with them, to see when it is that they become sad or depressed or angry. Or, you see, relying on their reports is going to be frustrating because they may not be able to report yet in a way that gives you the information you need.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, and little kids, they're really, you're right, they still learning the whole art of communication and what it is and how and what's uh, it's not just communication, it's being able to identify the feelings that they're feeling. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's just a little bit kind of switch over to anger. Okay. I want to kind of look on the subject of that right now. Now, one of the things before you and I went on live, I mentioned to you is how anger and depression, but then again, depression comes with the classification of you have to do more, you have to be able to identify what exactly, in what way do you mean, like the depression that you're experiencing. But when people feel anger, it's either they tend to, go from anger to being low, feeling down in dumps about whatever. Is it because, the fact that they're feeling helpless of the situation that they're going on, they feel like they can't do anything? Or is, also another thing is people can go down from feeling down in dumps to becoming like all of a sudden just like, you know what, I'm upset, I'm angry, because maybe they feel like maybe there is something to do something about it. But ultimately, and as if you have noticed that it goes, hand in hand. It's constantly fluctuating between those two. When people typically, dip in and out of those two particular emotions, those particular feelings. Does that make sense? But then again, with depression, like I said before, you have to be able to identify in what aspect, in what way is that person, do they mean by being depressed? So what would your insight be on that?
Well, my experience of it has largely either been subjective. I have been depressed at points in my life, but it's either that or it's a more clinical type experience where people come to me for help with what they feel is depression, right? So from either of those, with self-identification, there were things I knew I wanted to do. Uh, there was, relationships I wanted to have, qualities of relationships I wanted to have that weren't where I wanted them to be, and I was unwilling to take the effort to push them there. And the unwillingness was because I simply didn't have the energy to face it. That's when I realized I was depressed, and I went for care for that depression. Um, but with anger, it's a little more difficult because anger often is considered fairly normal. So when it gets to the point where you're lashing out at everyone in your environment, then people start to realize that's not normal anymore. But we were talking earlier off the air about the normalization of anger and how it's become part of our culture. So you find trolls online who are just trying to instigate an angry fight.
Right.
You find people who they don't really become engaged until they're angry. When I was a kid, it seemed like there was a lot more decorum with the adults in my environment. They did not express their anger except in private or their sadness. So now it seems like anger is more publicly acceptable than it used to be.
Right.
So it's harder to
Yeah.
identify as an illness or an unnatural response, right? And it's important to make a line of delineation, a difference between a natural response and a triggered response, right? So a natural response, we were talking about this also, like if a person wants to get into their home and someone will not let them in, you would expect a lot of expletives, maybe broken glass, and anger. I mean, let me in my house. That would make you very angry if someone wouldn't let you in your house. Or, you know, like another thing on the playground might be if someone won't give you the ball that's yours or something like that. Anger would be natural. But if you come home and you see a tricycle and somewhere in the back of your mind it reminds you of the time you fell off your bike and hurt yourself, and you become angry at people who leave tricycles out in the yard because they might get hurt, okay, that's triggered anger. And if you come in and you're angry at someone, it's not really a natural response anymore. It's something from the back part of your mind, which, if it became automatic and always on, would be an anger management problem. You know, everything makes me mad. It's generalized. It's no longer a specific response to a specific set of circumstances happening now. It's a pattern of responses which have become ingrained over time and which now are triggered at the drop of a hat, you know. So there's a big difference between those two. There's also cultural things, like, you know, I was a punk rocker when I was younger, and if you were a happy, contented, excited, and enthusiastic punker, that would be highly unusual. You know, part of the sensory thing that you did when you were a punk was there was pain involved, there was anger involved. It wasn't happy-go-lucky, and when it was often just silliness. That was my experience. You know, when you listen to punk music, with the exception of a couple of bands, it was mostly very angry music. It was a form of rebellion, you know, and that is more angry than it is content. So if a kid is a teenager and going through a punk phase or something like that, that's very different than if they are an adult who is constantly angry and has no control over it. I need more water. Pardon me. Just
Okay.
one moment.
Absolutely, go for it. All right, guys. In the meantime, while Ken went to grab some water, I'm just gonna really quick, just gonna mention this is, for instance, what Kevin's saying here. Actually, one of the things I've also noticed myself is that in today's world, especially, if you do look in terms of social, public, in terms of United States, or if you go to Russia, or if you go to Portugal, or if you go to Mexico, or if you go to different, countries, you can pick up a certain tone of, emotion of what people particularly portray, towards, everybody, just to each other. And one of the things I did notice here, for instance, United States, is that oftentimes, yes, anger has become socially, acceptable, and I think it's more one of the things that people kind of observe from each other and kind of like following, monkey see, monkey do, so to say. If you ever heard that statement before, mimic each other. And same thing with, kids, they mimic, they watch adults, and they just kind of learn that behavior, and it progresses on and on, right, Kevin? And so even in different, but if you go to different country, like for instance, let's just go to example Russia. One of the things you can experience over there is, notice the social tone in Russia is typically apathy. Kind of like, I know, whatever, so goes life, there's nothing much you can do about it, this is just how life is. Versus you can go to a different country and they're completely nutballs. They're all crazy there. They're just like, wow, all of a sudden just constantly excited and doing crazy things and whatever. But anyway, getting back into Kevin, what he was saying. Hey, Kevin, welcome back. How's the water? Much better?
I needed it. I was coughing.
Oh, good. Very good. All right. So, but as I just mentioned, different countries, different areas, they have absolutely different, you're going to pick up that different tone, of people, what they perpetrate towards, each other, right?
Sure. I had the experience when I was living in San Francisco of people being very can-do, socially aware, and willing to do something about it. They want to demonstrate their feelings. They want to demonstrate their policy interests and stuff like that. Whereas here on the northeast of the United States, it's much more reserved. People still, there are, of course, in each of these places, there are reserved people in San Francisco and there are people who are very out and flamboyant in the Northeast. But in general, it's much more conservative in the Northeast. There's I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe it has to do with Puritans having been here and controlling the environment for a long time. But you know, I found it much easier to express myself and have people listen to me when I was on the West Coast, and then for people to do things about it. Whereas here, everything is very much, I think, similar to what you were talking about with Russia. Maybe it's not the same in terms of apathetic, but staid, conservative, unwilling to change anything. Things are good enough. There's no reason to change anything. So I find that to be the sort of tone, if you're going to pick up a tone around the Northeast. So even within a country, and even within affluent areas of the country where the coastal regions are considered to be the very left-wing areas, but in the Northeast, in Boston and Providence and New York, even though they may be left-leaning politically, they're still very conservative when it comes to their own culture. They don't want their culture to change. They don't see a problem, so they don't want it to change. And if they do see a problem, they want to change very slowly and carefully because things are good enough. Don't go crazy changing things when everything's good enough for most of us. So
Right.
now that may have been an illusion the entire time. My point is you're likely to pick up that social reticence if you're in the North. People don't really talk about their emotions. It's not Dr. Phil here. So if they're going to do that sort of thing, it's at home or it's with a therapist, or there's a huge percentage of people in my area that are Catholic. So they might go see their priest, or go to church and talk with their church community. But it's much less something which is just a social thing to go out and talk about how you feel and what causes you'd like to be interested in. So to throw out that as a change in areas, even within a country. Now the U.S. is big, but we have lots of different regions, and I've lived in most of them. And there is a very different emotional expression in each area that I lived in, and I don't think one of them is right and the other is wrong. It's just that's the way I found it to be. So as it affects the individual, each individual is going to be different no matter where they are. So you have to kind of figure out where you're comfortable being and stuff like that. But that's neither here nor there when it comes to the idea of triggering, except that maybe your triggered responses might be acceptable in some places and unacceptable in other places. You know,
Right.
uh,
Right. And I think that in some places, like you said, it's not acceptable. In some places it is. It's because certain areas, they, so to say, they can deal with it because they've seen it before. They've been up that road with that particular, you know, behavior, and this to them it's like, okay, whatever, this is just another day to day thing. For me, where if you were to bring this particular attitude behavior to a different area where typically that is not accepted, they're gonna be like, hey, what's wrong with you, why are you being this way? So like for instance, you may have heard that people say, well, New Yorkers have a huge big attitude.
right.
They're always acting like they're angry and they're always pissed off about something. Well, no, not necessarily. That's just not how it is. That's just,
In the 70s and 80s, things started to change in the 90s. And last time I was in New York, everyone was extremely nice to me. It was, there wasn't the old "fu" attitude that used to exist in New York when I was growing up as a kid. That's really not the case there anymore. I'm not sure why that is, or if it's because I'm older and I now have a bit more money, so I go to places that are nicer or more full of well-to-do people. But my experience is that that attitude is no longer quite as present as it once was in New York. You know, so these things change over time with cities just as they do with people. Um, but anyway, my point is, what can you do about it if you're angry or sad or depressed? How do you break out of it, both long term or just immediately? You know, and I found that there are ways to do that. So if you want to hear a few of them, I'll list a couple. For the long
absolutely.
for the long term, there are things you can do. I think we talked about this in another show. Meditation
Yes.
is something you can do for yourself in the long term, which will help to break patterned ways of thinking. If you're looking for professional help, you can do therapy of various kinds. I would recommend the TIR, which is traumatic incident reduction, which is aimed at reducing a symptom in a few sessions or one session. Um, but a much more immediate thing you can do is simply change your environment. Since many of our emotions are conditioned by the environment we're in, if you find you're sad or angry or whatever, and you're always in the same place, just change where you are. Literally, physically change where you are. Go out and go somewhere else. Change your environment. The other thing you can do is get up, start changing your environment in your home. Change your job. There's a lot of different ways you can make changes short of much more radical life changes, which you might need to do also, but I would do that in consultation with the people you're making your life with, you know. But by yourself, you can do things like meditation for the long term, changing your environment, trying to change what you notice about your environment. Because a lot of our attention is on automatic most of the time. We pay attention to the same things all the time, and when we get shaken loose of that, we become a little uncomfortable with how to deal with it. That discomfort you get better at dealing with by experiencing it and learning to control it. Right? So at first it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but learn to look at different parts of your environment. It literally from physical parts of your environment, look around the room and find something you like type of thing, to find something about an object that you could like or a person that you could like. It's a change of focus, right? Part of the problem with depression is that people tend to stay the same. They get sort of locked into a frame of mind, and the slightest change can knock the depression away for a while. But it may take a little while to make that change, and it may not feel real or natural at first. Like it might feel contrived, and that's because it is, you know. So, but doing it over time, you change the way you naturally feel, and it becomes less contrived. So the old expression was "fake it till you make it." Right?
Right.
If you don't know what you're doing, pretend you do, and the environment will correct you until you really do, you know. But don't accept that you don't know, and so therefore I won't do it, or I don't know what will happen if I change, so I'm going to remain the same, even though I'm sad or angry. All right. Anything I've been saying, bring anything up you want to ask about or say anything about?
Yeah, it does actually. Like for instance, I want to, bring up the whole anger thing again. Now, let's just say you are finding yourself, or the person may find in themselves in like a situation where they're really just having a hard time pulling out of it. They're just so stuck in that to a point where they actually feel like they're going mad. They feel like they're losing their sanity. They're so just irate over over whatever that's going on. They're so angry that you just cannot pull out of it. So, for instance, you may, I mean, I'm sure you've heard a lot of cases, where kids absolutely just going absolutely just angry. And it's not just kids, it's not just teenagers, it's young adults, it's all ages really, where a person just feels like, what, I've had it, I don't, want to, just, I don't know what else to do with this anymore, and whatever they're dealing with, they're finding a hard time to control it to a point where they find themselves lashing out at the environment, at the people in their environment, and they start to damage property even. They even start to hurt themselves because they just really don't know what else to do, to a point where they even find them, harm to themselves. Now, that's pretty, in depth right there, where when a person is that angry to a point where they just cannot pull themselves out of it mentally, they cannot, take that image or whatever that's going on, whatever that's really, really bothering them. What would you simply just advise on that? Because sometimes, it's easier said than done, right? Where people just really find themselves like, wow, I am just not having a good day, and I just seem to really cannot pull out of this today. I'm just so pissed off at the world right now. I don't know what to do. And they tend to make, permanent decisions for, temporary feeling, which is, the temporary feeling is they are very angry, and they end up making a decision that's gonna permanently affect them to a point where they can damage themselves and people around them. And so the biggest thing is, how do you really address that?
It's so well. Sometimes it's not simple. Sometimes a person isn't going to be able to shake themselves out of it. They might be able to, but sometimes people need either professional or at least well-trained help, you know, or someone who really knows them and knows how they get into these things and how to get them out. So it comes down to knowing yourself really well, right? As we get older, we tend to know ourselves better and better, but no matter how old we are, we have blind spots. You know, your level of wisdom about yourself is going to be different than the way other people see you. So one way to do it is to try asking other people if they see the same thing as you do, you know. So in terms of snapping someone else out of their anger, if they are willing to change their perspective on their anger, you probably don't have to do very much. The ones you need to worry about are the ones who are not interested in snapping out of it and want to hurt someone, you know? So I'm not sure exactly what your question is. Maybe I need to have that amplified. Um, are you talking about like helping someone who is a danger, or?
Yeah, well, like let's just say, like, just earlier we talked about the fact that it's just a matter of choice. Just stop and just pull out of it. And
Oh, I see.
sometimes simple matter of choice is not coming easy for that person.
So when it comes down, the thing is while things might come down to a choice, the choice isn't, do I feel good today?
Right.
Do I do the things that will make me feel good down the line? You know what I mean? It's not, sometimes it's not going to be immediate. No matter what you do right now, things might be screwed up today. They might be screwed up for 3 years. They might be screwed up for 7 years. It depends how bad the decisions were that you're now having to fix. You know what I mean? And sometimes they're out of your control. The situation is simply out of your control. It might be health. It might be something going on in your neighborhood that you just can't control. And it really comes down to what it is that's making the person really angry. If it's a neighborhood thing, maybe they need to move, because you can't decide for everyone in your neighborhood how things are supposed to be. You can only decide for you. So, for instance, I've lived in high crime areas. I decided to do so because the rent was lower there. It was a conscious decision on my part to live there, despite the fact that I was going to run into real problems. Kitty would like to get on top of the computer keyboard. So anyway, I had to leave those neighborhoods because I was not going to be able to lift everyone out of poverty, change the behavior of drug dealers without the aid of police. I wasn't going to be able to change the behavior of the police department. So you have to sort of pick your battles. And that one was one I had conscious control of. I could move, so I did. I didn't want to face that every day. Didn't want to have to fight for the honor of my girlfriend because every time I walked past a certain corner, she got catcalls, that sort of thing. So
Right.
I had to change my environment, and that led to big changes in my life across the board. The same can be said for other people. The question is, it comes down to a decision, right? Do you accept that I am going to stay where I am, and now I have to focus on changing my environment or changing my responses to my environment? Or is it just time to leave that environment? So it's very much something which you have to get to the bottom of with the person you're working with, right? In the case of a kid who's living with their family and has no control over where they're going to live, or even where they're going to school, or whether they go to school, or lots of things are controlled when you're a child. The child needs to learn to self-regulate, because if they constantly act out, it's only going to harm them. If they act against themselves, it's going to harm them. If they act against their parents, it's going to come back to them. If they act against their school, they're not going to get a good education. So at that point, you need to regulate your responses to your environment rather than change your environment. So it comes down to the situation of the person who has anger or sadness or depression problems, right? I have friends who say they have anger management issues, but when I ask them or press them to do something about it, they don't. So they've accepted that they're going to be angry and unhappy rather than make a change. At that point, I stop trying to help them because they don't want to change. They just want to complain, you know? So there's a difference between a genuine desire to change and get better, feel better, have a better quality in your life, and an interest in just complaining or being or continuing to be angry. And I'm not saying people shouldn't express their anger or their sadness. They should feel comfortable doing so, especially if it helps them. But if they have no interest in getting better, then over time I get less interested in hearing it or in helping them. So it's about the decision of the person who's in the circumstance. If they've decided it's going to persist and they're just going to complain about it, they can do so on their own. They don't need my help.
No, you know what? I agree with you 100%. What you said right there is actually very perfect because, it really, like, just like you said, you have to pick your battles. You really, really do. Some of the things you find yourself upset about, angry about, is it really worth it? How much impact is that going to have on you? Why would you allow yourself feel that much anger over something? In the long run, it's just going to, damage you. It just becomes a loop, that's going to play over and over again, and it's going to make room for more thoughts to come in to even be very, very angry. Next thing you know, you're just, doing and saying things that's going to damage you and other people and your relationship. So I agree with you absolutely. When you say that it's a matter of decision, and again, with the matter of decision, it is about picking your battles. With, is it worth it? Why do you want to continue being angry? Yeah, absolutely. Anger is, something needs to be expressed. But I also believe that, being able to express your anger in the right way, where it's not gonna, make, let's just say, a permanent, damage to, because you're temporarily feeling upset. Hey, I'm temporarily feeling upset, so I'm just gonna go and do this and that and screw somebody over's life, and I'm gonna screw my life over and whatever, and nothing else matter. And the next thing you know, you feel better, you pull out of it, and then you look, and you're like, oh my God, what did I just do,
You have a lot to repair.
Was that?
At that point, you have a lot to repair.
You have a lot to repair. That's right. I mean, and that's just that, I mean, again, really, it's so important, picking the battles, your battles with why you're feeling angry as, the way you do. And it's not really just that. Also, with the whole thing of depression, which, again, as we discussed earlier, depression, you have to be more specific in terms of what do you mean by that. And also asking yourself really, why am I feeling the way I am feeling? Is this even worth it? Can I do anything about it? If I can't, then, hey, let it go. If I have no control of it, then why am I sitting here and stirring myself up to a point where I'm upset and I'm not living a happy life because of a situation that I simply have no control over? And so being depressed and being classified in that, in what terms, in what ways, also, I mean, again, really, and with anger also, you have to ask yourself, hey, is this really worth it? Why am I feeling the way I am? And, do I need to sit there and stir? And, or can I just, simply just like let it go? Or if I can't do something about it, do it, but do it in a way where it's not gonna, damage people in ways that you're gonna regret big time later, so.
I would recommend is consulting yourself with your goals. Yes, I could spend my entire life and join law enforcement trying to force people to obey laws because I feel that they should not be loud late at night, and it makes me mad. So now, ultimately, the only way I control that is to get the badge and go around and enforce noise violations. But do I really want to be a cop? Some people do. It's an honorable profession. More power to them. It's not for me. I wouldn't want to face a lot of the other things that went along with being a cop. There's a lot heavier duties than enforcing noise violations. So my point is, there's a limited scale to, remember we were talking about identities, right? My
Hmm.
identity is that of sort of a Socratic teacher, a neighborhood eccentric, tennis player. Mm, there, I have various things I might be known for or appreciated for, but if I were to change that, it would require a significant expenditure of energy and a change of identity. Do I really want to do that? How important is that change to me, right? So it could be the noise violation thing I'm talking about. I mention that only because it's harmless and I don't have to give a trigger warning, you know.
Right.
But there's much more serious things than that I might want to change. The analysis is a cost benefit analysis, right? I'm angry about, let's say, something very realistic, let's say I have a mother who won't listen to me, right? And I'm always angry. I'm not saying I do, by the way, but sorry, mom. If that were the case, then it becomes a little more tricky because she's still my mother, no matter what I do. And if she won't listen to me, do I want to invest years of sort of forcing her to listen to me, or can I change my responses and my goals? How important is it to me that she listened to me, or is it just important that I be listened to by someone? you know so you have to become conversant and flexible. So there are times where the goals you have are unobtainable, or they'd be obtainable but you'd have to radically change your life, and the radical changes might then be attributed to the, like, if I did that, I might be then angry at my mother because I had to change my life in order for her to change you know so is that worthwhile to me? Maybe it would be for some people, maybe it wouldn't be for others. So you have to do an analysis of whether or not it's worth it to you to go through that. And if you're, the thing is most people do this automatically without a deliberate assessment of what they're doing and why they're doing it. They may have been fighting with a sibling or a parent or a child for decades and not even realizing that it's really not worth it to them, that person's not going to change, or if they changed, it would represent an amount of effort for them which would make their whole life about that, and it's not worth doing. you know so it really comes down to an assessment. I like to put things in perspective of goals and purposes because it helps me as a, I don't like to say counselor because I don't offer counsel, but as a teacher, I like to draw people out and find out what their goals are. And then if there's something obstructing them and they really want that goal, then we create a plan on how they can achieve that goal. My phone's ringing. It
Right.
does that. It's a telemarketer. Um, so I'm going to let it ring for a minute because it will distract me otherwise.
Okay.
But the point is, absent sort of the framework of goals and purposes, understanding depression becomes a psychiatric thing. It's like if a person has no goals and purposes for their life, it would make sense to me that they were depressed, even if they didn't have a genetic or psychiatric propensity towards depression. You're going to feel like life is going nowhere because it isn't. you know,
Right.
you don't have a plan. You're not making progress. You don't feel like you're going anywhere. Even if the plan is, I'm going to have a nice day, you usually have a definition of what a nice day is in your mind. So you go out and you try to do those things which are a nice day to you. You're nice to people. You hang around with people who are nice to you. You go to some pretty environment or whatever it is that's a nice day for you, and you do those things. It's not just, I hope to have a nice day. And if that is the case, it's no surprise to me that sometimes your days are not nice. You need to have a plan. So
Right.
it doesn't have to be super well defined, but you do need to have a plan. So if someone comes into me and tells me they're depressed, not only do I want to know what their symptoms are, but I'm very interested in what their goals are. You know, if they have no goals, that could be why they're depressed. That could be the whole long and short of it. They may feel like they're incompetent and not capable, and the reason is they've never tried to do anything, and they don't realize how capable they are. And they've never learned that they can change what they're capable of through practice and effort. So it really depends on what they mean and whether they have goals, Or maybe they have some goal and they've never realized that it's not realistic. That goal is not realistic. You know, it's like, I want to go to the moon. All right, I'm not Elon Musk. I don't have his billions, and I can't just buy a spaceship, test it, and eventually go to the moon. Maybe it could, but it would require a massive investment to get there. So it's not a realistic goal for me. Maybe it would be realistic to become an astronaut, but if you had become an astronaut when you were my age as a kid and you wanted to go to space, you'd be really disappointed right now because they're not going. You know, something I'm angry about, you know. But, you know, so sometimes things are outside your control, and that's important to recognize also. You know, some people get divorced. Nobody ever, when they get married, usually intends to get divorced. And it feels crappy when it happens. And maybe you're depressed afterwards. Maybe you're angry at your ex-partner, that sort of thing. But there comes a point where you have to let that go if you're going to have a good life from here on out. You know, you don't want, if you got married to a person, you probably want them to have a happy life. You know, that was why you married them, is you wanted to make them happy. You wanted to be happy with them. So if your life becomes about making the other person miserable or demonstrating how miserable you are to that other person, the intention to be happy with that other person has gotten really warped along the way. And it's time to take a look at it and what's going on now, because you're no longer doing the thing that you said you wanted to do, you know? So sometimes things get broken and fixing them is not possible. You know, it's like you can't unbreak a glass. It's a lot of glue. It's never going to perform the way it did once, you know?
Right.
So sometimes you just have to let things go, including people. So once you accept that things do change, and sometimes it's really an unwanted change, it becomes about changing the way you react, changing your goals, and learning to be flexible. You know, it would be nice to be able to say, whatever your goal is, you can do it, and other people will never get in the way, and they'll never cause problems, and everything will be the way you want. But that's not realistic. So if you want to live in the real world, you have to have real goals. You have to understand your purposes. You have to have a plan. And if emotional things come up, including anger and depression and things like that, that's part of your system telling you that either you're not making progress, or the barriers are more significant than you had expected, or, you know, there's a lot of things getting in the way of you getting where you want to go. But usually the number one thing is you don't know where you're going. You don't know why you're going there. You know, the song that comes to my head is the Talking Heads' Road to Nowhere. You know, we don't know where we're going. We don't know why we're doing it. We won't know if we get there, you know. So a lot of it becomes about recognition. If you want to be a less angry and less depressed person, you have to form goals, learn the skills needed to get there, and learn to identify what's happening in yourself and get help if you need help, and do other things that will help yourself, like yoga and meditation are good things that help almost everyone. So if you don't want professional help, those are good ways to do it. There's also other ways of self-expression. Poetry, journal entries, artwork is a great way to express yourself. And sometimes all that needs to happen is an expression, and then you can let it go, as long as it's acknowledged by the person or people that need to acknowledge it. You know, does that help?
That does help a whole lot. Thank you so much, Kevin. And Kevin, just real quick, we're actually drawing to a conclusion of our show. I would like for you to share again about you, about your practice, and how people can get in touch with you if they want to obtain your services.
Okay. Can you drop a link into the chat? I don't know how to.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look over here.
Okay, hold on a second. Here, we'll do that.
Okay, great.
So my practice here, which is Clear Objectives. That's my practice. But my practice is based on metapsychology, and you can find that out more here. You guys are terrible. I'm not angry about that.
Okay. All right. And I can also go ahead and post your links again on my page, also on Let's Only Be Positive page, and my personal Facebook accounts. And even I will type in your website underneath this video right here.
Synopsis of my practice. I've already done a little bit, but it basically consists of an inventory of issues that a person has, uh, an inventory including traumatic experiences that have happened, troubling or troublesome relationships. Uh, those things get assessed, but also the part of it that I found a lot of my fellow workers in the same field don't really address. They take a more clinical approach and work on the trauma and the depression and the symptoms, but few of them actually go the extra leg of assessing what it is the person wants in their life, helping them come up with that program. There are some that do, but not enough, even within my own discipline. So a lot of them get focused on the trauma end, but don't provide the framework to assess whether or not progress is being made. You don't know if progress is being made. If all the person doing it is going, that feels better to have said that, that may be true that day. But if the next day they go out and kill someone, is that progress? Are they moving along their own goals and purposes? So I have them create what I call it's called an objective map, right? It's basically a sort of detailed, granular plan of how to get from here to there, right? It can be a business plan if a person is a business person. It can be a student agenda if they're planning on studying a subject. It basically goes across their entire life. And there are a number of different plans at work at the same time. So the goal is to assess every session. How are they doing with that? Have any issues come up? And address those first before we get back to clearing away the trauma, unless that needs to be handled first, right? So sometimes things are really pressing and a person comes in and they're in tears. Well, you're not going to talk to them about their life plan. You're going to find out why they're crying, So my structure is, if they're not currently disturbed, to work on their plan with them. If they're currently disturbed, to alleviate the disturbance. Then get back to working on their life plan. Because people feel better when they feel like they're making progress towards something they want. So that's the long and the short. There are two sides of it, and if you don't address both, what happens is the person feels great, maybe, but they don't feel like they're making progress. And when people get into what they're calling therapy, very often what they really need is a structure for their life. They don't know where they're going or what, what I'm saying? So it's easy to get overwhelmed and depressed if you don't feel like you're going anywhere. So consider that, because the clinical nature of the way people understand depression makes it always seem it comes down to brain chemistry. It's a problem in my brain. So I'm depressed and I need medication or I need therapy. But that may not be the case. Some people, yes. Some people, no. So as a person who's trying to help others, I need to have both sides of it. I need to understand that the reason right now is that they're upset. But when that's cleared away, they might have gotten upset in the first place because they had no plan. And so they fell in with people who were just having a good time, and just having a good time led to a needle in the vein, smoking whatever, and doing harm to themselves over the long term for a short-term high, or whatever it doesn't have to be drugs, could be sex, could be anything. People use just about anything to anesthetize themselves to a life which is not satisfactory. So a lot of the problems that we experience are self-inflicted. While things can happen in the environment, especially when you're children, that you can't control, and those will need addressed later in life, as adults, at a certain point, you're expected to be able to bootstrap and take yourself where you need to go. But that's not taught to people how to do that. So if they haven't had good modeling from a parent who showed them how to get where they want to go, or a guidance counselor or a shaman or whatever it may be, they may need some help. And they may think they're depressed when really they have no goals. So I think I've made my point, and I don't want to beat it into the ground, but that's where I go.
You definitely made your point. It sounds perfect. It's well put. Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it, and thank you so much for coming on the show today. I love everything you had to say. It's so wonderful. And you guys, for those of you that are tuning in, thank you so much for tuning in today. And do look for us in our next show, which we'll be doing in the near future. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.